For decades, some of the most chilling crimes in history remained unsolved, leaving behind mystery, fear, and countless unanswered questions. From a shadowy figure who hijacked a plane and vanished into thin air, to a ruthless serial killer taunting police with cryptic letters. These cases gripped the world, confounded investigators, and took years, sometimes decades, to crack. But through relentless determination, groundbreaking forensic science, and shocking confessions, the truth finally emerged. Today, we uncover the 10 FBI cases that took decades to solve, and the twists that kept them in the dark for so long. Let's begin. The Unabomber, 1978 to 1996. Ted Kaczynski, also known as the Unabomber, terrorized the United States for nearly 2 decades with a series of deadly bombings that targeted individuals he deemed responsible for advancing modern technology. A former mathematics professor, Kaczynski retreated to a remote cabin in Montana, where he meticulously crafted his homemade explosives. His bombing campaign began in 1978, when a package containing an explosive device was discovered at Northwestern University. Over the years, he continued sending bombs through the mail, often disguising them in seemingly innocent packages. His targets included university professors, airline executives, and corporate figures, leading the FBI to label him as the University and Airline Bomber, which was later shortened to Unabomber. As his attacks escalated, Kaczynski's bombs became more sophisticated, causing deaths and injuries while leaving investigators frustrated. The FBI struggled to identify him due to the lack of forensic evidence and his ability to remain off the grid. His bombs were carefully constructed to avoid leaving fingerprints or other identifying marks. Law enforcement formed the UNABOM task force, which spent years analyzing his methods and attempting to track his movements. Despite extensive profiling efforts, investigators remained clueless about his identity. The breakthrough in the case came in 1995, when Kaczynski demanded that major newspapers publish his manifesto, Industrial Society and Its Future. The Washington Post and the New York Times complied, hoping it would lead to his capture. David Kaczynski, Ted's brother, recognized the writing style and ideas in the manifesto and became suspicious. After comparing it with personal letters from Ted, he contacted the FBI, leading to the identification of the Unabomber. In April 1996, agents raided Kaczynski's remote cabin in Lincoln, Montana, discovering extensive evidence, including bomb-making materials, detailed journals, and a live explosive ready for use. Kaczynski was arrested and later pleaded guilty to multiple counts of murder and terrorism, receiving a life sentence without parole. His case remains one of the most extensive manhunts in FBI history and serves as a chilling example of how a lone individual can elude law enforcement for years through careful planning and isolation. The Golden State Killer, 1974 to 2018. The Golden State Killer, one of America's most notorious serial predators, evaded capture for over 4 decades. Active in California between 1974 and 1986, he was responsible for at least 13 murders, over 50 rapes, and more than 100 burglaries. Initially known as the East Area Rapist and later the original Night Stalker, his reign of terror spanned multiple regions, and his ability to disappear without a trace baffled investigators. His crimes followed a terrifying pattern. He would break into homes at night, often targeting couples. He would restrain the male partner before assaulting the female victim, sometimes spending hours in the home, taunting and psychologically tormenting his victims. During the 1970s, law enforcement agencies worked tirelessly to track him, but the lack of DNA technology at the time left them with little evidence beyond his disturbing modus operandi. He would often call victims after his attacks, whispering threats or heavy breathing into the phone, demonstrating a sadistic need to instill fear long after the physical assault had ended. As the years passed, the attacks continued, with a shift toward brutal homicides, leading to his evolution from a rapist to a full-fledged killer. His crimes eventually stopped in 1986, but investigators never gave up on identifying him. The breakthrough came in 2018, when advances in genetic genealogy led authorities to Joseph James DeAngelo, a former police officer. Investigators used an innovative technique, uploading DNA from old crime scene evidence to an open-source genealogy database. By identifying relatives of the unknown suspect, they built a family tree, narrowing it down to DeAngelo. After covertly obtaining his DNA from discarded items, authorities confirmed a match to the crime scene evidence. In April 2018, DeAngelo was arrested at his home in Citrus Heights, California. At the time of his arrest, he was living a quiet, suburban life, a stark contrast to the horror he had inflicted decades earlier. Facing overwhelming evidence, DeAngelo eventually pleaded guilty to the charges, avoiding a trial and receiving multiple life sentences without the possibility of parole. His capture was a landmark case in forensic science, proving the power of genetic genealogy in solving cold cases. The Golden State Killer's decades-long evasion of justice and his eventual unmasking is a testament to both the persistence of law enforcement and the advancements in DNA technology that now make it nearly impossible for criminals to remain hidden forever. D.B. Cooper hijacking, 1971 to ongoing mystery. The mystery of D.B. Cooper is one of the most legendary unsolved crimes in FBI history, capturing the imagination of the public and investigators for over 5 decades. On November 24, 1971, an unidentified man who would later become known as D.B. Cooper boarded Northwest Orient Airlines Flight 305 from Portland, Oregon, to Seattle, Washington. Described as a middle-aged man in a suit and tie, he took his seat calmly and passed a note to a flight attendant, which initially went unnoticed. When she finally read it, she was stunned to see that he claimed to have a bomb in his briefcase. Cooper discreetly opened the case to reveal red cylindrical objects connected by wires, making it clear that his threat was real. He demanded $200,000 in ransom, 4 parachutes, and a fuel truck ready to refuel the plane upon landing in Seattle. The airline complied, and after the ransom and parachutes were delivered, he allowed the passengers and most of the crew to leave, keeping only a few crew members on board. Cooper then instructed the pilots to take off again, heading toward Mexico City at a low altitude and a slow speed. Sometime during the flight over the rugged terrain of Washington and Oregon, Cooper opened the plane's rear air stair and parachuted into the stormy night, disappearing without a trace. Despite an extensive manhunt, the FBI was never able to determine his true identity or locate him. Over the years, numerous suspects have been investigated, with theories ranging from an experienced paratrooper to a desperate businessman seeking a new life. The only physical evidence recovered was a few decayed $20 bills matching the ransom money found by a young boy along the Columbia River in 1980. Despite advances in forensic science and countless investigations, D.B. Cooper's fate remains unknown. Did he survive the jump and escape successfully, or did he perish in the dense wilderness? The FBI officially closed the case in 2016 after 45 years of investigation, but the legend of D.B. Cooper lives on, inspiring books, documentaries, and even Hollywood adaptations. The Boston Strangler, 1962 to 2013, DNA breakthrough. For years, the identity of the Boston Strangler haunted law enforcement and the public as one of the most chilling serial murder cases in American history. Between 1962 and 1964, 13 women were brutally murdered in and around Boston, Massachusetts. The victims, mostly older women who lived alone, were strangled with articles of their own clothing, often left in disturbing positions. The killer gained entry by posing as a maintenance worker or repairman, exploiting the victims' trust before attacking them. The city was gripped with fear as the murders continued, with no solid leads or suspects. In 1964, Albert DeSalvo, a convicted rapist, claimed responsibility for the murders while in prison for unrelated crimes. His confession detailed aspects of the killings that were never publicly released, leading many to believe he was indeed the Boston Strangler. However, without physical evidence linking him to the crimes, doubts remained. Some investigators suspected that multiple killers might have been responsible, or that DeSalvo, eager for notoriety, fabricated his confession. He was sentenced to life in prison for other violent crimes, but was never officially convicted of the Boston Strangler murders. For decades, the case remained unresolved until a groundbreaking forensic development in 2013. Investigators used modern DNA technology to analyze biological evidence from the final victim, Mary Sullivan, and compared it to DeSalvo's genetic profile. The results provided a conclusive match, confirming that DeSalvo was responsible for at least one of the murders. To further validate the findings, authorities exhumed his remains and retested the DNA, reaffirming the link. This breakthrough finally provided closure to one of the longest-standing mysteries in criminal history. Although DeSalvo was killed in prison in 1973 under suspicious circumstances, his confirmed involvement in at least one murder cemented his status as the prime suspect. However, some experts still believe that he may not have acted alone, or that other unrelated crimes were falsely attributed to him. The Boston Strangler case remains a haunting example of how forensic advancements can solve even the coldest of cases, bringing justice to victims decades after their deaths. The Zodiac Killer, 1960s ongoing mystery. The Zodiac Killer is one of the most infamous unidentified serial killers in American history, responsible for a string of brutal murders in Northern California between 1968 and 1974. His reign of terror began on December 20, 1968, when a young couple, Betty Lou Jensen and David Faraday, were shot to death on a secluded road in Vallejo, California. Just months later, another couple was attacked in a similar manner, but one victim survived, providing the first description of the killer, a stocky man in dark clothing. Unlike most serial killers, the Zodiac reveled in taunting the police and media. He sent cryptic letters to local newspapers, demanding they be published, or else he would continue killing. These letters contained bizarre ciphers, some of which remain unsolved to this day. His murders continued in a seemingly random pattern, targeting both young couples and lone individuals. He sometimes wore an executioner-style hood, as seen in the attack at Lake Berryessa in 1969, where he stabbed a couple repeatedly after tying them up. In another chilling incident, he ambushed a taxi driver in San Francisco, shooting him in the head before escaping on foot. Despite numerous eyewitness reports, police were unable to apprehend him. His letters contained disturbing details, including a symbol resembling a crosshair, which became his signature. The Zodiac claimed responsibility for dozens of murders, though only 5 were officially confirmed. He often mocked law enforcement, boasting that they would never catch him, and even sending a letter with a piece of a victim's bloody shirt to prove his crimes. Over the years, countless theories emerged about his identity. Investigators interviewed numerous suspects, including convicted criminals and mentally unstable individuals who falsely confessed, but no conclusive evidence linked anyone to the crimes. In 2021, a team of amateur sleuths known as the Case Breakers claimed to have identified the Zodiac as Gary Francis Post, a deceased Air Force veteran, based on forensic evidence and coded messages. However, law enforcement has not officially confirmed this finding. Despite forensic advancements, the Zodiac's identity remains one of the greatest mysteries in criminal history, ensuring his legend endures in books, films, and conspiracy theories. The Atlanta child murders, 1979 to 2022, reopened DNA analysis. Between 1979 and 1981, the city of Atlanta was terrorized by a series of horrific child murders, with at least 28 victims, mostly African-American boys, brutally killed. The murders gripped the city in fear, as children and young teens vanished, only to be found strangled, beaten, or drowned. Law enforcement struggled to find a pattern, and panic grew as the death toll increased. The media dubbed the crimes the Atlanta child murders, while the FBI and local police launched one of the largest investigations in U.S. history. Despite numerous leads, no clear suspect emerged, and the African-American community accused the authorities of failing to act swiftly. In 1981, police finally arrested Wayne Williams, a young man linked to 2 adult murders that bore similarities to the child killings. He was stopped on a bridge where bodies had been dumped, and fibers from his home and car matched those found on several victims. After a highly publicized trial, Williams was convicted of the murders of 2 adults and sentenced to life in prison. The prosecution suggested he was also responsible for the child murders, leading authorities to close most of the cases, assuming he was the culprit. However, controversy surrounded his conviction, as Williams maintained his innocence, and many in the community believed the police had scapegoated him to wrap up the investigation. For decades, questions lingered about whether Williams was truly responsible for all the murders or if multiple killers had been at work. In 2019, Atlanta's mayor and police chief announced a reopening of the case using modern DNA technology to re-examine the evidence. By 2022, new forensic techniques had identified additional fibers and DNA that potentially linked Williams to more victims, though no conclusive proof was released to the public. Despite the advances, doubts remain about whether the true extent of the crimes has been uncovered. The Atlanta child murders continue to haunt the city, symbolizing both a terrifying chapter in its history and the relentless pursuit of justice for its victims. The Cold Case of Jacob Wetterling, 1989 to 2016. The abduction of Jacob Wetterling was one of the most haunting unsolved cases in American history for nearly 3 decades. On October 22, 1989, 11-year-old Jacob was riding his bike with his brother and a friend near their home in St. Joseph, Minnesota. A masked man with a gun emerged from the darkness, forcing the boys to lie on the ground. He asked them their ages and then ordered Jacob to come with him before disappearing into the night. Despite immediate efforts by law enforcement and a massive search operation, Jacob was never found. His disappearance shook the nation, leading to one of the largest child abduction investigations in U.S. history. For years, investigators pursued various leads, but none led to Jacob's whereabouts. His parents, Patty and Jerry Wetterling, became outspoken advocates for missing children, pushing for changes in laws to protect minors. The case remained active, with investigators suspecting a connection to other child abductions in the area, but without physical evidence, they struggled to identify a suspect. In 2014, a break came when authorities re-examined a 1989 assault on another boy, Jared Shirel, who had been kidnapped and released in a nearby town just months before Jacob's abduction. DNA analysis linked the assault to Danny Heinrich, a man who had long been on law enforcement's radar, but had never been charged due to lack of evidence. In 2016, under mounting pressure, Heinrich finally confessed to abducting and murdering Jacob. He led authorities to a remote area where he had buried the remains nearly 27 years earlier. The confession was heartbreaking for Jacob's family, but it brought long-awaited closure to a case that had gripped Minnesota and the nation. Heinrich, already facing charges related to child pornography, was sentenced to 20 years in prison as part of a plea deal, as the statute of limitations prevented him from being charged with Jacob's murder. The resolution of the Wetterling case underscored the importance of persistence in cold case investigations and the power of DNA in bringing long-lost answers to grieving families. The capture of Whitey Bulger, 1975 to 2011. For over 16 years, James Whitey Bulger was one of the FBI's most wanted fugitives. evading capture despite being one of the most notorious crime bosses in American history. As the leader of the Winter Hill Gang in Boston, Bulger controlled a vast criminal enterprise involved in drug trafficking, extortion, loan sharking, and multiple murders. What made his case particularly shocking was his secret role as an FBI informant, feeding law enforcement information about rival gangs while continuing his own illegal activities. When federal agents began closing in on him in the mid-1990s, Bulger was tipped off, allegedly by his corrupt FBI handler, and went on the run in 1995, disappearing without a trace. For years, authorities followed leads across the country, and even overseas, but Bulger remained elusive. His ability to alter his appearance, use fake identities, and access hidden cash reserves made tracking him nearly impossible. Despite being placed on the FBI's 10 most wanted list, second only to Osama bin Laden, he managed to evade capture. The break in the case came in 2011 when the FBI changed tactics. Instead of focusing on Bulger himself, they targeted his longtime girlfriend, Catherine Gregg, by running a nationwide media campaign about her. A tip led them to a quiet apartment in Santa Monica, California, where the elderly couple had been living under assumed names for years. When authorities finally arrested Bulger at the age of 81, they found a stash of weapons and over $800,000 in cash hidden in the walls of his apartment. His capture ended a decades-long manhunt and brought him back to Boston to face justice. In 2013, he was convicted of 11 murders, racketeering, and multiple other crimes, receiving 2 life sentences. However, his story did not end there. In 2018, Bulger was brutally murdered in prison by fellow inmates, marking a violent end to one of the most notorious criminals in U.S. history. His case remains a stark reminder of the deep corruption within law enforcement and the extraordinary lengths to which some fugitives will go to remain hidden. The kidnapping of J.C. Dugard, 1991 to 2009. The abduction of J.C. Lee Dugard remains one of the most harrowing kidnapping cases in American history. On June 10, 1991, 11-year-old J.C. was walking to her school bus stop in South Lake Tahoe, California, when a car pulled up beside her. Before she could react, a man used a stun gun to subdue her and forced her into the vehicle while her stepfather, Carl Probin, watched in horror from their driveway. Despite his immediate attempts to chase the car on his bicycle and alert authorities, J.C. vanished without a trace. The case quickly became a nationwide story, with her mother, Terry Probin, launching desperate efforts to find her daughter, but no credible leads emerged. Unbeknownst to the world, J.C. was being held captive just 170 miles away in the backyard of her abductor, Philip Garrido, a convicted sex offender. He and his wife, Nancy Garrido, kept J.C. confined in a series of hidden sheds and tents behind their home in Antioch, California. For 18 years, she lived in isolation, enduring repeated sexual abuse and giving birth to 2 daughters, fathered by Garrido. Despite the close proximity to neighbors and law enforcement officers who occasionally visited Garrido's home, J.C. remained undetected, as Garrido manipulated and brainwashed her into submission. The breakthrough came in August 2009, when Garrido exhibited increasingly erratic behavior and brought J.C.'s daughters with him to a University of California, Berkeley campus security office, claiming he wanted to host a religious event. The suspicious campus staff alerted authorities, leading to a parole office investigation. When officers questioned Garrido, his conflicting answers raised alarms, and they soon discovered that J.C. Dugard was alive and living under his control. Her identity was confirmed, and she was finally reunited with her family after nearly 2 decades in captivity. Garrido and his wife were arrested and later convicted, with Philip receiving a life sentence and Nancy receiving 36 years to life. J.C. went on to write a memoir, A Stolen Life, detailing her harrowing ordeal and recovery. Her survival story became a testament to resilience, shedding light on the psychological impact of long-term captivity and inspiring changes in how law enforcement monitors sex offenders. The BTK Killer, 1974 to 2005. Dennis Rader, infamously known as the BTK Killer, short for Bind, Torture, Kill, terrorized Wichita, Kansas, for over 30 years before finally being caught. His killing spree began in 1974 with the brutal murder of the Otero family, where he strangled both parents and their 2 young children. Over the next decade, Rader continued his sadistic crimes, targeting individuals in their homes, binding them with rope, and torturing them before ultimately taking their lives. What set BTK apart from other serial killers was his obsession with taunting the police and the media. He would send detailed letters to local newspapers, bragging about his crimes and providing specific details only the killer could know. Despite the FBI's extensive efforts, Rader remained anonymous, changing his methods over time and going dormant for years before resurfacing. His ability to blend into society made him even more elusive. He was a church leader, a Cub Scout volunteer, and a family man, giving no outward signs of his dark double life. By the early 1990s, the killings seemed to stop, and investigators were left with little forensic evidence to pursue. The case went cold, with no new developments for over a decade. In 2004, on the 30th anniversary of his first known murders, Rader reignited the case by sending another letter to the media, along with crime scene photos and a victim's driver's license as proof of his authenticity. This reawakened law enforcement's efforts to catch him. However, his arrogance ultimately led to his downfall. In 2005, he sent police a floppy disk with a message, believing it was untraceable. Investigators extracted metadata from the file, which contained a hidden reference to a computer at Christ Lutheran Church in Wichita, where Rader was a prominent member. They quickly identified him and obtained a warrant for his DNA. When tested against old crime scene evidence, his DNA was a perfect match. Dennis Rader was arrested in February 2005, and during his chilling confession, he described his murders in disturbing detail, showing no remorse. He was convicted of 10 counts of murder and sentenced to 10 consecutive life sentences. The BTK case is a prime example of how a killer's ego can be their undoing, and it demonstrated the power of forensic technology in solving decades-old crimes.